I would like to start by making questions whether the destruction of both humanity and nature has become normalized and accepted in the New World Order. And what we are witnessing today is the beginning of normalization of genocide as legitimate political choice, rather than merely an aberration or exception. So how it has become possible for entire cities to be wiped out, forests to be burned, and ecosystems and millions of years old to collapse in a world that claims to be experiencing a moment of a green transition and climate governance. These questions may seem simple, but they are in fact existential questions that transcend politics to delve into philosophy and ethics. Today, we are not addressing environment today as a mere slogan or a globally discussed topic, but rather to an attempt to understand it within the context of war itself, within Gaza, with a profound interconnectedness between the destruction of humanity and destruction of nature is laid bare. The transition separation between them collapses in the face of the fact that environment violence is a structural component of the very logic. The argument I wish to present today is clear. The world is not experiencing isolated crises, political here or environment there, but rather a profound structural transformation that makes violence against both humanity and nature part of the logic governing the world. This allows me to say that violence against humanity and nature are two forms of one single destruction or annihilation produced by the capitalist structure that is gradually evolving into a fascist oligarchy on a global scale. So we are living through a historical moment in which political violence and environmental violence are intertwined within the structure. In a simpler way, the environmental that were the international laws that were established after World War II. This logic can be termed as collective genocide or annihilation for the same reasons with the same mechanisms. To understand this shift, I pose central questions. Are we witnessing normalization of genocide? Has the market become into an authority that transcends international law, ethical standards, and environmental norms? What is the limit to which market forces can override international law? In addition, what does this shift mean for international powers in the global order, for the future wars, and for the very possibility of global justice? These questions are not merely theoretical. They may be the only way to understand the world's failure to protect the Amazon rainforest and why the environmental and humanitarian disasters of the Russian-Ukrainian war went unpunished, and why the world remains silent in the face of genocide in Gaza. These questions arise today because the global order itself has become a passive observer, unwilling to protect humanity and nature, preoccupied with reproducing violence in ever wider and more complex forms. Meanwhile, environmental movements are busy depoliticizing themselves and distancing themselves from the global politics issue and deepening the artificial divide between humanity and environment. To establish the concept of collective genocide, we need to understand the structural transformations that reshape the world. And here I have three cases to exemplify that. Since the end of the World War II, the international system was supposed to provide a safety net, global transformation from new liberalism to literary fascism. But there were chains that changed this system. First, the rise of the market to the position of supreme power. So the political or environmental decision is not independent from the interests of major corporations. So the environment is reduced to just resources, and humanity is reduced to productivity potential, and profit became the sole criteria of legitimacy. Second, the erosion of the international law and the return of the law of the jungle. International treaties such as environmental protection, prevention of displacement became non-binding references, and the weapons that were internationally prohibited now they are used in public. The threat of using nuclear force became a political tool, and the climate agreements became used for geographical purposes. International accountability mechanisms are clearly losing their effectiveness if they exist at all. It seems that we are in a post-law era, a moment where power is wielded without restraint. Third, the integration of environmental violence into a political one, where it transforms the environment from the subject of protection to one of control. Environment became a commodity, then a weapon, then a domination. The discourse of sustainability development has become to cover for the expanding the extraction projects and to expand the new markets. Moreover, disaster and while environmental disasters continue to spread. Moreover, war today destroys not only humans' lives, but also water, soil, forest, and environmental infrastructure, and even more. Environmental violence is no longer a byproduct, but a tool of control. These three transformations make genocide a natural or even necessary part in the logic of the new World War, unfortunately. Second, if we look how the genocide of people and annihilation of nature, how they cross-cut, to explain this, I have three bases to explain the logic. The climate genocide or extermination in the Amazon when the planet became an open colony. Despite the international funding, environmental initiatives, deforestation in Amazon continues at an alarming rate. Why? Because the agricultural market, the meat companies, and mining are more powerful than all the climate-saving treaties. What is happening is not an administrative failure, but rather a victory of market over environment. The governments that legitimize deforestation and open the land for extraction platforms, as what's happening in the Amazon, is nothing less than genocide or destruction of all the ecosystems, the water resources, the indigenous groups, the land privatization. And when the governments fail to address this means one thing, that the international capitalism does not see environment as a human or moral value, but rather an economic resource that can be consumed. And so this destruction or genocide is part of the strategy. Number two, the Russian-Ukrainian militarization nature. Usually wars are measured by human losses, but this war provided a clear example for environmental destruction as part of the military strategy, such as blowing up dams, polluting rivers, urban land, and emissions and destruction, industrial and displacement of people, and the rest goes on. Here too, the world did not consider destruction environment as independent crime, but rather it dealt with it as collateral damage. And what happened here is the fusion of military and environmental warfare. And again, the question comes, is environment outside the realm of ethics when it comes to the interests of the major powers? The third case, and the most explicit one, not because it witnesses one of the largest massive genocide and destruction, but rather it's a dual genocide. It's Gaza, a human genocide that is used, an example, destruction, killing, displacement, complete destruction, starvation, in addition to environmental genocide, such as destruction of water, sanitation networks, air pollution, the transformation of neighborhoods into toxic rubbles, the devastation of agricultural land, and the of the beaches and all forms of life. Gaza here is not merely a place of devastation, but rather a mirror that reflects the collapse of the global order in its savage neoliberal movement. The word that remains silent about genocide in Gaza is the same one that is silent on the environmental and human destruction of the planet. Silence is not helplessness or isolated incident. It is a structure. It's a structure. And what connects these cases together, I can say that we are turning into an international fascist oligarchy. What connects these three cases are joint mechanisms. That is, ending the value of life, the devaluation of life. Human environmental life is measured in terms of profit and loss. Number two, the alliance between the state and the capital, where you cannot separate politics from major corporations, especially in the energy, food, and military technology. Third, justifying destruction through rhetoric of necessity, while I speak about development and combating terrorism and others. Number four, collapse of the state's deterrent capacity, courts, agreements, oversight mechanisms, all designed for a world that has reached a stage where they no longer exist. So consequently, violence is no longer external, but rather a mechanism of its rule. Here, move to another question. Where are these transformations headed? If the current trends continue, the world is heading down three dangerous paths, and maybe more. Number one, the normalization of genocide as a political practice. Widespread violence will no longer be a shock, but rather a tool of governance, and we witness more wars that do not distinct between humanity and environment, which makes violence against humanity and environment inseparable form of violence. Number two, militarization of climate. With the environmental crisis worsening, water, energy, and food will become causes of conflict. We will witness wars over resources or climate borders that separate those who have the right to life and those who lack the means. Number three, the rise of fascist oligarchy, an elite that possesses economic, media, and military power and decide what is politically and morally permissible. In this world, the planet becomes uninhabitable except for the few capable of avoiding the effects of collapse. Political and economic decision-making is monopolized by a small elite that has the power to create disasters and survive them and determine who lives or who dies, and those who deserve protection or who not. Back to my first question. Is destruction nature and human a natural thing? The answer, we are rapidly approaching that because the international system is legitimizing violence and serves its interest, because the market is the reason for legitimacy, source of legitimacy, and not environment or human. But the question that might be more important, what does this mean for the future of the world and future wars? This transformation means that we are living through a pivotal moment where the world is becoming to a space where genocide, both human and environmental, is practiced as natural acts. It also means that the future wars will not only target enemies, armies, but also the environment as a tool to destroy societies. Natural resources will become a focus of increasingly violent conflicts, wars of water, food, and destruction of land and cities. This is precisely here that the post-human era emerges, an era in which the definition of who deserves to survive and those who do not is redefined. Protecting environment will no longer be a technical issue, but a liberation struggle linked to resisting colonialism, impoverishment, and tyranny. Environmental justice will not be achieved through the current international system because it is the source of genocide, producing genocide. What to be done? Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of ready-made solutions, but we have basic lines for resistance. I believe integrating environmental justice with the political justice as part of the liberation project does not separate between the resistance to occupation, resistance to destruction of nature, but rather reconstructing a universal concept for the right to life that includes human and nature outside the logic of the market, and exposing the structural relationship between political and environmental violence, Because what's happening in Gaza, Amazon, or Ukraine are not isolated incidents, but rather part of a single global logic of genocide. And certainly attempting to build a transnational social alliances movements capable of confronting the planetary fascism from outside the state and outside international institutions that are crumbling under the weight of impotence and incapability. I conclude with this. Gaza is not an exception. Gaza is the final warning. What's happening is a concentrated model for what's happening in the world. What kind of future do we want? Who has the right to life? Who has the right to land? Gaza is not an exception. Amazon is not an isolated environmental case. And the Russian-Ukrainian war is not a military conflict, but rather these are the link in a single chain, a chain of a world collapsing morally, environmentally, and politically. The question that remains for us all is not what is happening, but rather, are we going to allow this collapse to turn into a future? Because what is happening in Gaza shouldn't be read as an exceptional event, but rather an intensified model for what is happening in the world. Gaza is not just a victim of the war, but a mirror that reflects the new situation of the world. This world that contributed in action or with silence over what's happening in Gaza and allowed for this form of violence to be imaginable in its ethical, political, environmental system. What happened in Gaza wouldn't have been possible before a decade, but now it became a natural logic that is in an international system that is working towards moral and environmental disintegration. Silence over what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the world environment has the same incentives. And again, the question that goes, where are we heading to with these transformations? Again, it's meaning Gaza, with all its strategy and resilience, became a planetary warning, reminding us that the world is entering a new phase of violence and that defending life with all its forms is no longer an intellectual choice, but rather an existential necessity. Thank you.